panel this morning, which is Do They Really Care? Reporting Hate to Social Media Platforms. My name is Daniel Kelley. I'm the Director of Strategy and Operations for the Center for Technology and Society at ADL. And I have the great pleasure and privilege of introducing an esteemed panel of experts to talk about this subject this morning. Yael Eisenstat is the Vice President of the Center for Technology and Society. She leads ADL's effort to hold big tech companies accountable for hate and extremism on their platforms. She works to ensure that online spaces are safe, respectful, and inclusive, and helps to lift the voices and experiences of those most impacted by online hate and harassment. Yael joined ADL in October after spending more than 2 decades protecting our democracy, including as an intelligence office diplomat and White House advisor. She joined Facebook in 2018 as the head of global elections integrity for political ads, following several years as a vocal critic of the harms that social media inflicted on democracy and societies worldwide. After leaving Facebook 6 months later, she spoke openly about the company's inability to meet its responsibility to secure elections, and she has continued to push for changes in the tech industry. Our next panelist is Kat Lowe. Kat is a content moderation lead at Meedan and a research affiliate at the UC Irvine Center for Responsible, Ethical, and Accessible Technology. Her work seeks to translate the experiences of targets of harassment and moderators in online communities into product and policy insights for social media companies and civil society organizations. She has provided crisis support for targets of online harassment for over a decade and has worked with Online SOS, Tall Poppy, the Southern Poverty Law Center, World Economic Forum, and the Fair Play Alliance to tackle issues around misinformation, online hate, and harassment. Viktorya Vilk is the Director for Digital Safety and Free Expression at PEN America. She creates and runs the organization's online abuse defense program, which equips writers and journalists with self-defense resources and training, partners with media organizations and publishers to strengthen protections for writers and journalists, and conducts research and advocacy to hold tech companies accountable for online harm. Her work has been featured on PBS, the New York Times, Slate, Harvard Business Review, and she speaks regularly about digital safety and press freedom, including for Online News Association, RightsCon, Investigative Reporters and Editors Journalism, Women's Symposium, and MozFest, among others. Because we're in person, we can do a thing like a big round of applause for our esteemed panelists. That's great. I was really looking forward to that. Yael, why don't you sort of set us up here? Talk a little bit about CTS's research on this, as well as your experience being at a platform and understanding a little bit more about what platforms do care about and what you saw in your time at the platform in terms of what they do prioritize. Oh, sure. Can people hear us in the back? No, they can't hear you in the back?
We have seats up front still.
Can we turn up the volume a little bit? I can talk louder too.
All right, can you hear me? Can you all hear me in the back? See, it's about putting yourself right into the microphone.
I will do that.
All right, hi everyone. For those in the back, I'm not going to give my whole bio again, so I'm just saying really excited to see you all. It has not even been a full month since I've joined ADL to head the Center for Tech and Society, and wow, what a month it has been. So I'm here to frame the conversation about do they care, what do they care about, but I want to really ground the conversation in what is the experience that people are having when they're trying to report hate and harassment online, and what does that say about these companies' priorities. There's a whole broader conversation that I'm not going to have time to get into today about all the different ways companies are incentivized to protect users, as well as what are the broader ways to hold companies accountable to the users. Some of these companies don't like the term users, but people who use a platform, I mean, I'm not quite sure what the other words that more accurately portray that. So grounding it a bit in, do they actually care about the experience of a user when they are harassed online and really driving home the important point of there's this thought that many people have, oh, but it's just online, or oh, being harassed online is not that big a deal. So when I was at Facebook, and I was hired there in 2018 as someone who had already had an entire career of really working on defending our democracy and on a lot of these issues and on counter-extremism issues. Really spent years understanding how people are radicalized and then translating that to how are people becoming radicalized online now. So you asked, do they care? What are their sort of priorities? And I knew this before going there, but it was very clear, at least at Facebook, which some will call Meta now. I will still call it Facebook. It's not a secret that protecting the very people who they rely on in terms of using the platform is not the number one priority, right? The number one priority is growth. The number one priority for a company like Facebook, and I'm not saying this is equal across the board for all tech companies, but a company like Facebook's goal of connecting everyone, for those in the back, I put that in quotations, connecting everyone, means having to be able to get as many people in the world on their platform and staying on their platform so that they can get us as much of our data as possible in order to really serve their customer, which is their advertiser. Now, I'm not going to give the whole speech about that, but how that applies to today's conversation is I have never said that I believe that Mark Zuckerberg's goal was to create a platform full of hate and extremism and harassment. I'm not saying that was the goal. But when you decide that your goal is to become the de facto public square for the entire world, and it didn't happen by accident, this was the ultimate goal and strategy, then I believe you bear the responsibility for being a good steward of the world's so-called public square. And being a good steward, oh, wow, thanks, of this means building in the capacity to protect the very people who you have enticed to come use your platform. And so to cite a little bit of CTS's, the Center for Technology and Society's own research, and Daniel will correct me if I get any of these statistics wrong because some of this predated me coming in. So CTS does this annual survey really looking at Americans' experiences on the platform and reporting hate and harassment. And what's interesting is, to the best of my understanding, we really looked at for actual violence and threats online. That should be that's the bar, right? If somebody is flagging that they are experiencing violent threats on your platform, how is the platform handling that? And what the survey in 2022 found, which unfortunately and sadly does not surprise me, is that 50% of adults who stated that they did experience threats online didn't even bother to report it, which in and of itself means that they probably either didn't know there was a way to report it, which is problematic, or assumed that their reports wouldn't go anywhere. So that's a really concerning statistic. But of the people who did report, only about 50% of them even found that the social media companies took action. And amongst youth from 13 to 17 years old, if I'm remembering the statistics right, 70% of them reported, and only around 40% of them actually led to results from the platforms. So we're going to talk about a lot of that today, But what that demonstrates is what people like me have been screaming from the rooftops for years, that these companies are not prioritizing the safety of the very people who use their platforms. And I just want to unpack a myth right now, because they will say they are trying, but there's just too much out there. Again, these companies intentionally and recklessly scaled to have that many people on their platforms, and therefore I believe it is incumbent on them to live up to the responsibility to protect the people on their platforms. So I don't buy in, and having worked there, no, I don't buy into the myth that they're trying and it's just too hard. And so we'll come back, I'm sure, to me for some comments afterwards, but I just wanted to kind of throw out some of those statistics and really emphasize that, yes, there will be some error along the way. I know that there is human error, there's machine learning error, but you have to actually not just say it's a priority, but resource the capability to enforce these policies. And that's what we haven't seen. We've seen most of the moderators are either outsourced contractors. We see that from the leadership itself has not made this a priority. And if your employees are not incentivized to make it a priority to protect people, they're not going to.
Thank you, Yael. Really appreciate your perspective on that. And I think, I know on the flip side, both Kat and Viktorya are working with people who are experiencing targeted online harassment, threats of physical violence. So I'm wondering if either Kat or Viktorya, you can start by talking a little bit about what is that experience like, right? What is the experience of people who are targeted by online hate and harassment? What can that look like? And what is their experience of engaging in reporting to the platform, trying to get someone to help them?
First of all, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you all so much for coming. If you can't hear me in the back, wave at me or something, and I'll try to yell or into the mic. So I created and now run PEN America's program on online abuse defense. And I've been doing that for about 4.5, 5 years. And one of the primary focuses of the program is self-defense training and resources in the online space, right? And so we have now, our resources and our training have reached hundreds of thousands of people in the US and internationally. We work primarily with writers, journalists, artists, and human rights defenders. And I can tell you that their experiences online, especially on the platforms that they need to do their jobs, are pretty atrocious. I mean, when we talk about abuse, I think it's important to understand, like, what are we actually talking about, right? And I'm talking about things like posting your home address and threatening your children and your mom, hateful slurs, constant sexual and very gendered harassment against women and non-binary folks. I mean, hacking, impersonation, trying to get people fired, it goes on and on. And the truth is that that has real impact. It has impact on people's mental well-being, right? It can cause actual PTSD for folks who've been in really, really serious targeted harassment campaigns. It can cause stress, anxiety, depression, sleeplessness. That's the mental health impacts. But of course, we know that mental health impacts your physical health, right? So, and your well-being. It has impact on people's ability to express themselves. Because if you are afraid that someone is going to hurt your children or your mom, you might be much less willing to use your voice and to speak because you're trying to protect the people you love and yourself. But finally, we actually know that online abuse often leads to offline violence. And I can give you just one example. So my domain is writers and journalists, right? That's the focus of our organization. There was a massive study that, first of all, I love ADL's annual hate and harassment study. I use it all the time, everywhere. Second of all, there was a fantastic study focused specifically on the experiences of women journalists all over the world from UNESCO and ICFJ. It found that 1 in 5 women journalists who had experienced online abuse said that it turned into offline violence or offline physical attacks in their lifetime, right? So 1 in 5, which is insane. So I think I'll leave it there because Kat has had as much, if not more, firsthand experience as I have trying to help people in the day-to-day of what happens when they're being attacked and abused online, and they try to turn to their employers for help. They try to turn to the platforms for help, and they often find nothing. And they are left entirely to their own devices. And if they're lucky, at some point they find an organization like one of ours who does their best to help. But it's definitely an uphill battle. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about your experience and also like what you've seen when people try to report abuse and hate and harassment.
Yeah. Wait. Okay. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, great. So, gosh, I don't know where to start because there's so much. So you talk about like these explicit threats of offline violence and explicit slurs, but the thing that we also see constantly that creates this environment of toxicity and feeling just sort of ever more marginalized, like on top of what you see in news cycles and everything. I mean, you see people pulling these tactics, like instead of saying the word Jews, they use the word juice, like orange juice. And that helps them evade like different types of moderation. And then when you report it, what does a content moderator see? They see the word juice, and they're like, I don't understand what the issue is. And then on top of that, seeing people reporting systems, and honestly, the way that platforms often see harassment and abuse is through these sort of singular moments, right? A single point of interaction. And a single individual. When so much of harassment and abuse happens, it persists, even just, with stalking, with mass harassment, with people following you across platforms. There are so many things to say, like so many methods that people have that you just simply can't reflect in a reporting form, at least in the state that they are in now. And it is very difficult to think of ways to create better reporting forms because these trust and safety teams at social media companies, a lot of these individuals really care, but they're not resourced. Trust and safety teams will see their funding decrease, their head count decrease. And then if you have the engagement team versus the trust and safety team, who wins? It's going to be the engagement team. And so I kind of, spend a lot of time working with targets of harassment, just sort of sitting with them. A lot of the time it's working through, safety protocols, like making sure their passwords are unique and everything like that. And I think a lot of it, it becomes very transparent how psychological it is, in the sense that when I sit down with them, a lot of it is, it feels better to feel safe. But the other element of it is that you kind of, you feel gaslit. You feel like, like the platform isn't doing anything. Like, how serious is it? So that when I sit down with people, some of them just start crying when they feel recognized for the hate that they experienced, because it's the first time somebody told them this is really bad and something should be done about it. And even if nothing can be done about it, at least they're recognized for it. Yeah.
Thanks, Kat. One of the things, we talk a little bit about some of the statistics, right, about the ways in which women are targeted or the ways in which Jews are targeted. But I wonder if you can speak a little bit in either of your experiences about the ways in which people's experience online changes or is amplified if they are part of multiple identities, right, or multiple intersecting identities, right, a Jewish woman, a person of color who's a member of the LGBTQ community. How does that change the experience of somebody who's experiencing online harassment?
So I can give you a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is it's a lot worse. The long answer is what we know, and there's so many studies now to back this up that it's incontrovertible or whatever the word is. We know that women, people of color, LGBTQ folks, members of religious and ethnic minorities are disproportionately targeted for abuse online, and that abuse is different in nature, often very identity-based, compared to everyone else. However, the more intersectional your identity, the worse it's going to be for you, right? If it's precisely as you said. If you are a black Jewish woman or a non-binary person, you are going to be attacked from all sides on all facets of your identity. On top of that, people are attacked for their profession. So I work, like I said, primarily with writers and journalists and human rights defenders, right? These are folks who are often pushing boundaries, trying to hold power to account. They are lightning rods, and they have been historically, for attacks, but now those attacks are manifesting online, offline, and everything in between. And then people are also targeted for what they write about or try to speak on, right? Especially if it's, I would say, and I used to say, especially if it's a, politicized or controversial issue, but actually that's not even true anymore. People who write about makeup, people who write about sports, any woman who tries to write anything about tech, I mean, honestly, like, you can go on and on. So, the research we've done around what social media platforms can and should do, what we've said over and over again is that if you prioritize building for and taking the safety into consideration of your most vulnerable and marginalized users, you make your platform better for all of your users, right? All of your users will benefit from focusing on the folks who get it the worst. But what's actually happened historically in platforms is the polar opposite, right? Platforms were built by and for primarily white dudes, let's be honest. And then, like, 10 years later, after enormous outcry from civil society and some of their, celebrity users, et cetera, they've started trying to pick at bits and pieces of this problem of what happens to the most marginalized and most vulnerable people on their site.
So, yeah, on top of that, I mean, you answered a lot of the questions that I would answer, but I think actually adding on top of what you're saying is, like, the white men are prioritized. I think a lot of the language that social media companies use is the average user. And if you look at who works at social media companies, the average user at a social media company is a relatively wealthy, technically, like, proficient white man who's straight and heterosexual, right? And so, yeah, they don't necessarily know how, I'm gonna talk about reporting forms even more. They don't necessarily know how to design reporting forms for these, different experiences of marginality, especially intersectional. And again, thinking about that single unit a reporting form is oriented around, if you wanna report things for racism, homophobia, and so on, you can't. It's like, which one? Like, and so people have to guess. Will the platform take racism more seriously? Will they take homophobia more seriously? And so you have to decide which of your identities is the most marginalized. I know. Neither, yeah. So yeah, you have a lot of challenges in trying to represent your own experiences through these forms and just through, expressing yourself to the platforms at all. And another element of this is from the side of pursuing support. When you have an intersectional identity, what communities do you have to support you? Because there are a lot of communities around, like, women in tech, or women who are journalists and so on. But what about Black women who are journalists, right? Queer and non-binary, trans folks who, like, there's a lot of things that people can attack you for. And there's also a lot of research, I think, about how certain things that relate to certain identities, I don't know, just like have a disproportionate impact. So there's research on how a lot of harassment of women, it does really affect them, but sexual harassment of women online really affects them. And so you can see that across identities, and managing kind of the trauma of these different forms of attacks against you is really difficult. And because you don't have communities that know how to engage with that intersectional identity you have, or they're very small communities, it's just difficult to find. So not only are you especially traumatized, but you don't really have an escape, you don't really have comfort that you would if, it's harder to find if you are kind of in just one category, I suppose.
I want to add another complicating layer here. So, in addition to, yes, there are some just really nasty people in the world. Is it any particular company's fault that there's nasty people in the world? I want to be clear that that argument as well falls very flat for me, and I'm just want to, because that is another argument that people like to use. There is an intentionality behind many of these campaigns that I think people don't fully grasp. It is meant to drive you offline. It is meant to silence voices. So here, social media is supposed to be the great equalizer that gives everybody a voice. But if you know, like I know now, when I am thinking about whether I'm going to tweet something today, I know the amount of hate that's about to come at me. Maybe it's going to make me say, maybe today I shouldn't tweet this. I'm not in the mood to have this amount of hate come at me today. And what did that just do? That silenced me. So it's not only just about, sometimes it is actually intentional, whether it's because a journalist is getting a little too close to the truth on certain things, or whether it is intentionally meant to silence people. So that's one thing that is really important. But also in terms of why aren't the companies doing more? Because in order to truly tackle this problem, it would require slowing down. It would require actually figuring out a form of customer service, right? It would require actually resourcing enough people to not just read those forms when they come in, but possibly even have to get on the phone with someone, which you will never find a tech company that is okay with doing that. These are not huge costs, but they will slow the company down, and these companies need to constantly increase their daily and monthly active users. So all the things we're talking about are fixable. They're just not the priority.
Thank you. No, I think that's sort of where we want to transition the conversation here, which is we understand tech companies are not doing enough. We understand the experience and the horrible experience that people have of hate and harassment online. But what should tech companies do, right? I know both of you have done some research and even work with various companies about trying to improve their services, trying to improve their reporting forms, their reporting flows. What should companies be doing in order to better address the needs of people who are experiencing these things online?
So, God, where to start? So there's, first of all, when you're talking about changing how platforms navigate hate and harassment, you can talk about policy, you can talk about product design. They are distinct, they are very intertwined, but they are distinct, right? And you can target different things. We have chosen, primarily, by we I mean my team within PEN America, more largely PEN America is doing a lot of different things, but my team at PEN America has chosen to focus on user experience and product design, because we wanted to basically make the case that there are certain things that are such low-hanging fruit that the platforms could fix if they chose to, that there is no excuse not to. And we published a report in 2021 called No Excuse for Abuse, which was 40 pages of very concrete product design recommendations through a free expression friendly lens, because we are a free expression organization and we are tired of the argument that no, free speech, we can't fix anything, it's too complicated. So we were like, no, here's 40 pages of things you could actually do that are free speech friendly. And we then, quick plug, the ADL has a really cool thing called the Pattern Library, which is a resource of essentially design recommendations for technologists on very concrete things they can do to combat hate and harassment on their platforms that are research-based and have demos that show you how it would work. And so then we took a bunch of the recommendations from our report, we collaborated with ADL, and we created a bunch of patterns that are specifically focused on combating hate and harassment. I'm gonna give you just like 3 examples so you get a sense of what we're talking about writ large, and then I'll hand over to Kat to talk more about how we could improve the system of trying to report abuse to platforms. 3 examples. Nobody should have to face online abuse alone, except that is actually the current reality. It's extremely isolating, and the systems basically force you into dealing with it alone. Simple thing. Allow people to give delegated access to trusted allies who can help them report, block, mute, document, whatever, right? Right now, you basically have to give your password to your friend if you can't deal with it yourself. And I can't tell you how many people have tried to give me their passwords. I'm like, please don't give me your password. So you can give people delegated access. You talked about customer service. I mean, when you are in the middle of an aggressive targeted harassment campaign and you're getting bombarded, you have a fight or flight sort of trauma response, right? You are not in a place to read 6,000 pages of policy documents, dig through trust and safety protocols, and figure out what to do. You need a human being to talk you through what to do. None of these companies, Facebook, Twitter, none of these companies have any kind of customers. You cannot find a human being. So they find people like Kat and I, and we do our best, right? But like it's totally not a scalable solution for Kat and I to be the solution for people's like human contact when they're in trouble, right? And then I'll give you just one more example. Right now, most of your reaction to online abuse is reactive, which means you've seen it. You've already been exposed to it, and then you have to figure out, what do I do with it now that I've seen all this junk and this horrible stuff? What we could do is we could proactively use machine learning and other systems to proactively filter this stuff out, like you do with spam in your inbox, shove it in a folder for you, or in a dashboard for you. You can go later if you have the energy and deal with it, or you can ask one of your friends or family members or allies to deal with it. I mean, these are just 3 out of 40 plus pages of very concrete things that platforms can do that they have not done or done piecemeal, because it does require some resources and it doesn't necessarily make a profit. And I have more to say later about what it's been like to try to engage with platforms on this issue and why they're not doing more, but I'm gonna stop there because I always love when Kat says smart and interesting things.
Thank you. Well, where to start? I think that's the problem is, well, there are 20 things. Which of those 20 do I pick? Well, I think thinking about the customer service angle that I think is really central. I have an anecdote from only a couple weeks ago. I was at a small bookstore and I was talking to the bookstore owner who was like, my account got hacked into and I don't really know what to do. I tried all of these things. Then I got an email that it turns out was from the hacker to get more information from me. And so I was like, okay, well, let's sit down. This is an older person, so maybe they're having trouble. But then when we sat down at his laptop and went through, this was Instagram, we went through all of the Q&A stuff, or the frequently asked questions for like, oh, what happens if my account is hacked? None of them quite applied to what was happening. So I thought, okay, well, normally there's a web form that you can use to escalate that that you don't normally have necessarily on the normal reporting system. So this is even like an alternative, more advanced reporting system, and it turns out they took it away. So that's no more. And so we literally just had no way to escalate. And I'm like, well, I'll talk to a friend or a colleague to escalate with them, or somebody suggested, well, why don't you tweet at Instagram? And I'm like, that is not a tactic that works at scale. And I mean, thinking about the product and policy distinction and why I think we think it's really important to focus on product is that you see a lot of very public discussions about these high-profile figures, like Steven Crowder, is harassing, a sort of conservative figure on YouTube was harassing another YouTuber who was gay and a person of color. And this was like very high profile. YouTube didn't really act appropriately, but there are many cases like this where people point to the policy and they're like, do something about this. And a lot of the time they will do something about it because the public eye is on them. But what about the millions of people who don't have the public eye on them? They have to rely on the product and how the product interprets policy. So I think, on some level, the policy goes can only go so far. But how it manifests in product is, really kind of, sometimes I think of product is policy in some ways. And so, people are kind of stuck and there's no form of escalation. Now all of the web forms are going away. And I guess you just have to accept it.
But there are organizations, certainly ADL has the ability, and again, it's not a scalable solution. When we talk to tech companies, we say this, right? They say, send us the things that you're seeing so that we can act on ADL's intel, which we definitely do when people, you can go to ADL's website and report hate that you see online or experiencing yourself, and we can escalate it to platforms, but it's not our job to do that at scale for every social media platform, right? And so there are some solutions, there are organizations that have the ability to escalate, but ultimately why ADL is pushing and working to make tech companies do better is because we can't be the ones doing the phishing for every tech company.
Can I add a point on that?
Absolutely.
So that's a really important point, and I want to drill down on that for a second. When I was at Facebook, yes, I was working more on the election space, but it was the same thing. We would go, I would sit in front of governments of other countries preparing for their election. And the answer would be, when the other country said X, Y, or Z is a problem, Facebook would say, you find it and then let us know, and then we'll look at it. That's really important to understand. That's the company saying, we're not going to proactively look for this ourselves. And again, this is not a legislative policy discussion right now, but there are reasons these companies don't want to overly proactively do this. But I also want to emphasize one other thing. So this is leading us all to probably feel a little bit helpless right now. And I do also want to say, at the end of the day, these companies can't survive without us on them. And we can all also flag other content. It doesn't just have to be the content that comes to us. I don't sit there all day and flag content. We're all busy. We have other things to do. But every now and then, if I'm scrolling Twitter and I see somebody saying something hateful about somebody else, I flag it. Because I've decided that I am not going to rely, unfortunately, on the companies to do this themselves. I am going to continue to push through my work at ADL on fixing those incentive structures and figuring out how to push these companies do better. But as an individual, I can flag hateful content. It doesn't have to be aimed at me. So we all can also, the more people start doing that, the more these companies, it is still not a priority for them, but the more people make it clear it's a priority, the more they might have to start paying attention.
It's a good point. I think as we sort of wrap up this conversation, we talked about how recalcitrant tech companies are. I think one of the things that folks can do is report hate, as Yael said, to their companies. There should be, at the activation station, there's a little card you can take that has our cyber safety action guide, which gives you resources on how to report to a variety of platforms. But again, the onus should not be on individuals at scale to clean up these platforms. So Yael, from your perspective, or from your perspectives, trying to get some of these recommendations implemented, what does it actually take, right? You talked about the public eye, right? The companies responding to things in the public eye. Is the only way public pressure to get these companies to move, or is there, and what does that look like, and are there other ways that organizations like ADL and others should go about making these companies make the changes that they desperately need to make?
So I think I know this is going to sound cliche, but it is a whole of society approach to get to where we want to be with some of these companies. I have spent a lot of time working on what accountability should look like for some of these companies as the most unregulated industry in the world. I look at not how do you regulate speech, but how do you regulate the company's own business decisions, design decisions, amplification of hate, all of these things. So that's one bucket, and I will continue to pressure on terms of tech policy. Then, of course, we have what we're talking about today. What can we as individual users do? And it's also, we don't talk enough about this, but I do, in ADL, you were just saying we have some information out there. It's also about educating, making it a priority to educate in school on digital literacy, to empower individuals on how to use social media in the safest way. There's a whole array of things we have to do, but fundamentally, it is absurd that it relies on nonprofits to do the work that these companies should be doing themselves, and public pressure is what makes lawmakers decide that it's important, is what makes a company decide it's important. So I will never undervalue the importance of public pressure.
Yeah, I want to, first of all, I totally agree with everything you just said. I want to give you a little bit more kind of detail about what it's like to actually work with platforms to try to, so when we published this report in 2021, let me zoom out and say this. It took Twitter, I think, 7 years to build a reporting button that was integrated in the platform, just so that everyone is, just let that sink in, right? Move fast and break things, except the reporting button, that doesn't happen for 7 years. So what's interesting is that if you had asked me a month ago how I felt, I would have given you like a much more optimistic outlook. If you ask me this week how I feel, clearly you can tell that I'm really fed up. But what we found after we published No Excuse for Abuse is that because it was very focused on concrete specific product recommendations, we actually, a whole bunch of doors opened to us at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, yada, yada. And we started working really intensely with all of these platforms on concrete product design changes that were directly connected to what people had been telling us for years they needed. And we were making real progress, right? And it took years of relationship building, trust building. What I found is that in every single one of these companies, there's the company, right? And then there are individuals who are incredibly committed within the company. They are our allies who are really, really care about this stuff and are really, really trying. They are often, in my experience, I found women with marginalized identities or with intersectional identities who are in those companies trying really hard to move the needle. And we were making real progress, and there was a whole slew of tools, features, and improvements, policy tweaks that happened in the last 2+ years, 3+ years, that I thought represented real progress. Incremental, not enough, but progress. As of last Friday, every single person that I have worked with at Twitter over the last however many years on this, they were all fired. So the entire human rights team is gone at Twitter. Many of the people who work on transparency, elections issues are gone. Meta laid off 11,000 people a few days ago. I have no idea how many of the contacts I've built at Meta over the last 4 years are still there, because it's not totally public yet. So if you feel my frustration, it's a little bit because I felt like we were finally making some progress, and then it was just like a nosedive in the last week. The people that I'm used to escalating issues to are not there anymore. So I'm not sure what's going to happen. I will say this. I think this will require a change in strategy, because there was a period of time where having back channel meetings and working with product designers and engineers was really leading somewhere. And I thought that was an effective way of making change, and writing lots of really good recommendations was working. That might still be true at some platforms, maybe TikTok, maybe Twitch, I don't know. However, I think that with Twitter, we're going to have to change tactics, right? It's going to have to lean heavily on public pressure, storytelling. You know, the campaign, that toxic Twitter campaign that's been being pushed by a whole bunch of organizations that I think you folks have been very involved with, in terms of having advertisers pull back because they don't want to have their, ads next to hate. So I do think, I don't feel hopeless. I feel frustrated, but I feel motivated. And I definitely don't feel hopeless, because you just have to be deliberate about what strategy you're using, given the reality that you can see that you're dealing with. It's hard for me to imagine how I'm going to advocate for product design changes with a Twitter that's owned by Elon Musk when they just fired all the human rights people.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, working with social media companies and having lunch with some folks in trust and safety, hearing the fact that the evaluation metrics that they have for employees are very engagement oriented, so that you have to justify keeping the trust and safety employees, because if you're an engagement person, you change the color of a button and look at some metrics, and that's a project done, you're evaluated very well. if you're doing this like complex system of people who are evading bans and doing all kinds of like difficult things to track, you did one project. So if you're looking at who to let go, you're gonna let the trust and safety person go. So I think that public kind of engagement is really important too, because it helps people justify why they're important within a company. And I think that's incredibly important. And one last thing too is I think there are gonna be a lot of platforms that are emerging, like especially with like young people who are using Twitter and Facebook less, and we need to make sure that from the beginning they're instilling these measures so that we don't have what's going on that's so bad right now.
So I've got some audience questions here before we wrap up, and some of them are related, I think, to some of the things we're talking about when we're talking about campaigns or we're talking about public pressure. One of the questions here is, based on your experiences, what types of arguments do you think are most persuasive to get social media companies to change their policies, if any? What is the best messaging? So I think this could be either in the context of public pressure, right, in terms of campaigns, or even in conversations when you're talking to the people who are working at the companies. What kinds of arguments are you utilizing to get them to change?
I'll start with the campaigns as opposed to talking to individuals, because you're right. Like I worked with incredible people when I worked at Facebook who wanted to do the right thing. Many of us were pushed out for wanting to do the right thing. But on the campaign side, you know, I haven't talked much about Twitter yet up here, but since you brought it up, I'm not 100% sure yet if this is going to be the right strategy with Twitter, because it's not 100% clear yet if the current owner wants to rely on advertising, but in the moment he still does. And so we did sit down with Elon Musk and had a conversation with the leaders of the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, which is the NAACP, Free Press, a variety of other groups, and made some real emergency demands for the first however many weeks and months. And when he did not live up to those demands, we relaunched Stop Hate for Profit. We joined with Stop Toxic Twitter to support that. And what is that about? It's about the fact that we all know at the end of the day, advertisers are what fuel this business model. And advertisers in general do not want their ads next to hateful content for pure brand safety purposes, for pure ROI purposes. And so for us, that is a very strong lever that we don't take lightly. We don't just decide to relaunch Stop Hate for Profit, but immediately you can already see that he has now been claiming to want to protect users because he sees that advertisers are pausing. So that's a hammer. That's not whether it succeeds or not depends on what direction he decides to take the platform.
Yeah, I mean, money, right? Money is a very convincing argument. You will lose money is a convincing argument. You are losing money, even more convincing. And then, you know, fear of losing their brightest, shiniest creators and influencers and people with the largest followings. And mixed bag, but sometimes calling out the hypocrisy. Do you remember, you know, in the summer of 2020, during the racial justice protests, all of these platforms made all of these statements about how much they care about race and marginalized groups. There was a period of time when calling out the hypocrisy of that, based on who was actually being pushed off of your platforms, you know, definitely generated bad PR. So bad PR, things that make people look bad, that works some of the time. But I think right now it's so volatile that I think we're all going to have to kind of wait and see what's going to work, because none of us have any idea what's happening at Twitter right now, and at this point I'm not entirely sure what's happening at Meta either.
Just quick +1, I think, yeah, advertisers all the way. And then, yeah, these creators who are huge, like there are some statistics about, you know, top 1% of creators are 90% of what people view. So they're really important points of intervention.
Let's see, I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Just have one of us answer instead of all three.
Yeah. I mean, Kat, this is a good one for you, actually. What is your response to people who are leaving social media due to negative effects on mental health? Both for users, but also for the people who are doing this work, right? And the impact that this could have on people who are trying to, yourselves or others who are doing this work.
Well, I think people should be kind of discerning on which alternative platforms they go to. People are talking about Mastodon and co-hosts and a lot of these other platforms, and I think it is really important to come out and support these alternative platforms. And yeah, mental health support is super important, and you're talking about also for the people who are doing that kind of work for platforms. I think they should unionize. Yeah. And not just unionize as like content moderators who don't have a lot of power within a company, but tech workers should be supporting those content moderators because they do have kind of that power because they're like highly valued by companies. I guess less so with all the layoffs, but they still have a lot of power to work with these people who are have less power within companies.
Thank you, Kat. Yael, do you want to sort of to wrap us up to tell us a little bit about what do you feel like is the most important takeaways for folks leaving this conference, and what sort of to look forward to in terms of the experience, to answer sort of do they care, and what will get them to care?
Sure. We're here today to talk about, the title is Never Is Now, right? We need to stand up and be willing to fight against, hate's a broad word. Like, we're talking about anti-Semitism, transphobia, racism, misogyny, all of these things. And unfortunately, in this exact moment, these largest social media companies have not demonstrated that they are going to live up to their responsibility to protect people. So on the one hand, we are going to continue it. I know through our work at ADL and with partners across coalitions, we are definitely going to do everything we can to continue to push the biggest platforms through, whether it's continuing the advertiser campaigns, whether it's using all of our might with media pressure and bad PR for them, whether it's helping our legislators figure out what is their responsibility here. We're going to use every lever of that, but I really hope that people who are here today, if you're either experiencing these things online or you're seeing these things online, you recognize that you also have tools you can use. It feels very small compared to the power of an entire company, but I believe your voice still matters, and the entire goal is to try to get you to feel like your voice doesn't matter. And so I hope that that might be one of the takeaways.
Well, I just want to thank my incredible panel here this afternoon, and thank you all for coming this afternoon, and doing a round of applause for our panels here. And thank you.
Thanks
Thank you all
for
very much.
moderating, Daniel. Thank you.